Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Welcome to Highest Power Church and State. This is Rick Pidcock, and this is episode 109. You may be hearing some different sounds in the background. I'm actually walking in the forest right now, and if you're wondering why I'm doing the intro while walking in the woods, I'll have more on that in a moment. But I've been thinking this week about James Talarico and his candidacy in Texas, and how a lot of people are excited, especially on the left, because he's talking about Christianity and politics in a way that resonates with a lot of Christians, and he just feels like a very fresh face. He's presenting Christian theology in a way that isn't threatening to his neighbors, and he recently just won the primary against Jasmine Crockett, who is a black woman. And that introduces a number of questions for a lot of people, because Jasmine Crockett was seen by a lot of people as unelectable. People talked about how she was too angry, she was too edgy, she was too out there. Democrats in Texas have been wanting to try to flip a Senate seat in Texas since 1988. They haven't been able to. And so you'll see people, they'll occasionally put out candidates like James Talarico, or before that, Beto O'Rourke, these smooth-talking white male politicians, and they feel refreshing to a lot of people. But then the black woman is unelectable, is too angry, is too edgy, is too out there. And in a recent piece, David French was talking about Talarico, and he was talking about how there are so few openly Christian politicians. And it led to a number of black people, especially black Christians, feeling very invisible. Jamar Tisby and Michelle Smith in particular. And so I addressed some of this in my most recent article, Why Are Evangelicals Freaking Out Over James Talarico? And was talking about how, like, on one hand, black Christians feel like they're not recognized as Christians. They're not taken seriously. Women feel like they're not taken seriously. And then you combine that and you have black women, and they're often at the very bottom of the hierarchy for being taken seriously in spaces that discuss Christianity and politics, that have a lot of white voters that need to find a candidate. And it reminded me of this archetype that is common in literature of women as the old witch in the woods. And they're often demonized as dangerous, or they're dismissed as crazy. We see this in a lot of Disney movies. And there's a book that recently came out. It's called Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods, Liberating Feminine Wisdom from Christian Patriarchy. And it's written by Angela Harrington. And she talks in that book a lot about how this old witch in the woods mindset of patriarchy gets mapped onto modern politics and onto women not being taken seriously and being demonized and othered. And so while there may be a lot about James Talarico that I resonate with, there's also aspects of the story that we need to take seriously when it comes to why black women are seen as not as electable as a smooth-talking Christian white man is. And so for today's episode, I decided to interview Angela Harrington about some of what she's observing and about her book, Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods, Liberating Feminine Wisdom from Christian Patriarchy. You talk about how Christian patriarchy teaches that women are dangerous, manipulative, and untrustworthy. And you explore that through the idea of women being cast as the old witch in the woods. I'd be curious if you could share some ways you've noticed this dynamic playing out in the church, in culture, or in politics.
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing that we need to be aware of is that there's so much conversation about being bad, being evil, being Jezebels, being deceptive, manipulative, all those things. And we're held up to this unattainable standard of we're either in that bucket or we're the perfect Mary, right? We're the Virgin Mary and just absolute sainthood. And like those are the two options for women. We can't be absolutely perfect, right? That's not possible. And so, what we find ourselves in is this category where if we push back against patriarchy, if we speak up against injustice, sometimes if we just speak our mind in basic day to day life, we must be in that category of troublesome women, high maintenance women, women who are selfish and manipulative and all of those things. And I think that's where the metaphor of the old witch in the woods comes from. She really is someone who, at least in literature and movies, she is someone who doesn't actually work hard to avoid that label. The label is just not a defining factor in her life. And I think that's why we're taught to fear her so much. We're taught to fear a strong, independent woman who doesn't bow down just because she gets criticism or because she doesn't look the way she's supposed to look. And I think we see that a lot in politics right now. Um, there's a very there's a very definite look. There's a very definite way of speaking. There's a very definite mold that we're supposed to fit into if we want to line up in any of the political camps. I mean, we see it. We talk about it a lot in the fundamentalist, super conservative side of things, but I don't know that progressive sides are that much better. It's deeply entrenched in all of those systems, including the church, and it's just in our face all the time.
How do you see those scripts showing up differently based on women's race and ethnicity, class, or age?
Oh man, so many circles. Without trying to reinforce a hierarchy, we just have to be honest that there is a hierarchy, right? I sit here as a white, educated woman in the Midwest who is married, hetero, cis. Like I tick a lot of the boxes. And so what I have to recognize is that I have a ton of privilege. I can walk into spaces that women of color can't. I can be a little more angry. I can be a little more loud. I can be a little more confrontational than some of our friends who are Black women of color, Indigenous women, trans women. Like there's just so many different layers of it. But what happens is every step you go down that hierarchy, which I don't want to reinforce, but it is just there, there's another layer of pressure and expectations that's put on you to be the quote good girl, right? To not make waves. So if you're going to speak up, if you're going to talk about injustice, if you're going to fight for people, the more layers of vulnerability you have in society, the more perfect and quiet and good girl you have to be because you're judged very differently than those of us that are a little higher on that hierarchy.
You talk about how Christian patriarchy separates us from ourselves and
Yeah.
each other and our creator. How do women, in a variety of women, experience the separation from self, especially in ways that men may not?
Yeah. Because we're taught that so much of us is bad, so much of our intuition, our heart, our passions, are just day-to-day life. So much of what makes us human women is bad. We have to, in air quotes, have to separate ourselves from that to be holy. And we're taught not only is that bad, that's bad in God's eyes, and that's rebellious. And whew, rebellious is a whole nother word that gets levied against us. And men are also harmed by patriarchy, just in different ways, right? So the way it shows up for women is that we are just told that if we get too loud, if we stand up for ourselves, especially against men, if we demand equal rights, equal pay, all those kind of things, that's not good. And good is in capital G, sacred good. So we learn to separate from those things. We start whittling out the things that we're taught are bad. And a lot of us who've grown up in conservative spaces, by the time we're middle age, we don't even know who we are. And I see this with a lot of my coaching clients who are starting to untangle from those things and just get to a point where they're looking in the mirror and they're like, I don't even know who I am outside of this context of who I was taught to be. I don't know what sexuality looks like. I don't know what my job looks like. I don't know how to be a mom or a wife or a sister or a child. Like, I don't know how to be those things because I was never allowed to figure out who I am in those early ages, in those at those early ages.
So in your book, you say from the witch hunts of history to politics today, women who express beyond a narrow range of emotions are seen as dangerous. It's
Yeah.
interesting because like in those early ages, kids express a wide range of emotions. And it's also interesting because when you look at politics today, especially, a lot of men are allowed to express beyond a narrow range of emotions. Like
Hmm.
if you saw women doing some of the things that Pete Hegseth or Donald Trump are doing, like no one would go for it, but then
Right.
those guys will get millions of votes, And so it's like why do you think women aren't allowed to express a broad range of emotions?
Yeah, and that goes way, 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 way back to the beginning where people started studying, what are the differences in people. And even the term hysterical comes from, there's a reason hysterical and hysterectomy have the same root. Basically, in common language, hysterical means your female parts are driving you crazy, right? So what we have to deal with is that foundational belief inside us and culture in general that when we get excited, when we get passionate about something, it's irrational. But men who are, we are taught, are more rational and more level-headed, when they get fired up about something, it must be justified. It's a strong leadership posture. And even when even when we see people screaming, we see people saying complete lies and being really defensive and really aggressive, the way that women are responded to versus men is radically different. So I think you're right. I think um, if when you see politicians, if they're doing even 5 to 10% of what some of these really out there guys are doing, they're getting tons of pushback, and they may not even get reelected because even in progressive spaces, we still have internalized that idea that loud loud emotional women are irrational, but loud emotional men are just strong leaders.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. One thing I've noticed is how women get separated from power in different ways. So, for example, you talk about women being labeled as dangerous, but I also think there's another way the separation happens where women get ignored as irrelevant.
Yeah,
And so, like, you have the witch in the woods who's dangerous, but then she's also off on her own somewhere. And so it's scary, but maybe a little somewhat cute in the sense that you can just ignore her as she blabs out there somewhere off on her own.
yeah,
And like you look in the political world, Democrats in Texas haven't won a U.S. Senate seat since 1988. And then they give us these smooth talking white male candidates like Beto O'Rourke or James Talarico. And those guys might be great guys. I might agree with them on a lot of different things, but Talarico's opponent in the primaries was Jasmine Crockett, who's a black
right,
woman.
right.
And like conservatives right now are freaking out about Talarico being more dangerous, more of a dangerous threat than she is, because they say he's more electable, that she won't appeal to moderates like or to Republicans because of how angry she is. And so she's just kind of seen as like just this blabbing, irrelevant woman out there on her own.
Yeah.
So how do you see patriarchy trying to isolate women in the woods as irrelevant?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing we see is that patriarchy and other imbalanced toxic systems are always built to protect themselves. And so when we look at these candidates and we say, okay, candidate A, the white dude, is more electable, that's not wrong. It's unethical and immoral, but in the system that we all operate in, It's true. I mean, look at who's gotten elected for the last 100 years, right? It doesn't mean that there weren't valid candidates that were out there. It just means that the system protects the system. And so if you want to have any power in the system, you have to play the game. And I think what we're seeing are just new generations of these brilliant women of color who have been able to get to a certain point in politics, in the church, in, decision-making powers in corporations. But at some point, they're hitting a ceiling where people say, "Yeah, that you're great, but this other person is better because they're more in control." And typically, that's white guys. That's wealthy, educated white men. Many of them aren't even as educated as the women of color that they're being pitted against. But again, we're bumping into those layers of bias and of hate. And I think as progressives, politically, I don't know that we're a lot better than the conservative side when it comes to breaking those barriers because there's there's still a chase for power. And as long as there's a chase for power, the majority of people are going to do what gets them more power, even if they're doing it for good. Even if the goal is like, let's get my candidate into office X so that they can make good decisions on policy. We're still in a lot of ways acting with, we're 2 feet right in misogyny and racism. And the candidates that I'm seeing, the women of color, even if they were acting in the same way as the angry black woman stereotype, they're still better qualified in a lot of ways than the guys who are making it through the primaries and getting up onto a national platform. So we're still, as a whole, I would say humanity as a whole, we are still propagating that internalized misogyny and racism, and we're we're just benefiting from it in ways that we should not be, and we're not looking in the mirror and being really honest about the cost of playing the game.
It almost feels like someone like Talarico, he has more hope that Republicans and moderates could change,
Yeah.
whereas a Jasmine Crockett doesn't share that same hope. She's just telling it like it is. Like, no, this is how bad the situation is. So it comes across as like, oh, she's just, angry and jaded. But she's probably a bit more of a realist.
Yeah.
And I wonder if some of that comes from the fact that she's experienced a lot more oppression than a white man, even a white male progressive has.
Yeah, and I can't speak to her experience as a woman of color. I can speak to my experience as a white woman, and I can tell you that we suck at listening to and supporting the brilliant women of color who have been sounding the alarm for decades. We will we have a long history of partnering with them to a certain point, and then kind of dropping out when it's just their rights that we're fighting for, and really siloing, the what they're fighting for versus what we're fighting for, when actually it's all wrapped up in patriarchy and Christian nationalism and all of those things. So part of it is realism, but also part of it is that the candidates like Talarico, they don't have to fight as hard. They don't have to be as honest because being honest when you gain power from a system is actually threatening your own power. So for example, for me, there's a lot of things that my Black activist friends, there's a lot of things for me that I don't have to say because if I'm quiet, that's the easy route, and it benefits me. Whereas if they're quiet, all it does is preserve that oppression. And so we get this messiness of like, yes, we have to have power, especially in political environments, to create change. But those of us leveraging our privilege to get power are harming the people that are typically left out of those powerful positions. So there's no easy answer. There's a lot of nuance to it, but I do think that no matter where we are politically, to some extent, we're benefiting from patriarchy. We're playing the game, and we're doing harm, even if we're somehow doing the gymnastics to justify that it's okay.
Hmm. So speaking of listening to women, you talk about feminine wisdom,
Hmm.
but especially today, there's patriarchy also talks about a kind of feminine wisdom in like the trad wife sense, where women are
Yeah.
wise who stay in their role and they'll just teach you how to be a stay-at-home mom and all this stuff. Like, how would you encourage our society to learn from feminine wisdom in ways that don't feed into the gender stereotypes that patriarchy depends on?
Yeah, I think anytime that you've got somebody coming to you and saying, this is the one right way, this is the one best way to fill in the blank, there's a motive there, right? So even if I were to come and say, okay, hey, I know you're deconstructing your faith and you're challenging patriarchy. Here's the one thing, here's the one right way I think you should walk through the world. That's just me propagating a different set of beliefs, right? Inviting you to a different cult. So what we really have to do is be honest about who we're listening to and why we're listening to them. And if we are separated from that inner knowing, from our inner wisdom, all those things we talked about earlier about like who were we allowed to be, what were we allowed to explore? If we are separated from the most sacred parts within us that are like, hey, yo, that's wrong, don't do that, it gets really easy to fall into those traps of someone else telling me what's right. I have a wild and, long and winding road to get where I'm at now. I was a stay-at-home mom for a little while. I was a working mom. Like, I have worn a lot of hats. The through line for me is that I could choose when I worked and when I didn't. I got to choose if I wanted to be the PTA mom and work at the same time, or if I wanted to be the stay-at-home mom. And I think that choice is just choice in general is one of the most threatening things to an unjust system. And that's why the Trad Wives movement is absolutely fully sponsored and backed by Christian nationalism, to the point where we even see a lot of these Trad Wives, they have jobs or they're not married or like it's just a facade. It's just this idea that if you work hard enough, if you give up enough, if you separate yourselves from the parts of you that you're taught are bad, you can thrive and you can fit in this system. And that system is usually tied to God's blessings. But the reality is, the more you give up, the more you focus on obedience, the more you listen to who other people say you should be, the less power you have, which means the more power other people have over you. And that's really the underlying reason that people are pushing tradwives and some of these other things. And I'm really grateful there's a lot of documentaries out. There's been some great ones that have come out in the last 5 years. And I have a lot of coaching clients who are like, dude, I had no idea I was in a cult until I watched that thing on the Duggars or until I watched that thing on, a cult that wasn't even in Christianity because we only know what we know. So if you grew up in a trad wife sort of environment, that's all you know. Nobody taught you differently. So a lot of the untangling is getting out of what you know and challenging it and asking it like, is staying home with my kids the problem? Absolutely not. Is believing that that is the right thing for every single human being who wants to have children? That's the problem. Like, if I know better than my neighbor how my neighbor should be living her life, that's a me problem. That's not her. That's my own ego.
That makes sense. So, in that untangling process, obviously, you're facing your things that you've been separated from. There's going to be a lot of need for lament. You talk about
Yeah.
holding space for grief. How can women and those who embrace feminine wisdom both express their grief over how patriarchy has separated themselves from self, neighbor, and God, and at the same time explore curiosity without shame?
Yeah, that's such a huge question, right? You and I are both authors. We could write 27 volumes on that question. So I think the most simple answer is that you don't owe anyone your grief or your explanation of your grief. So a lot of women who do this work who are surrounded by heavily patriarchal people, it happens in the closet in the middle of the night, like literally in the closet. It happens in the bathroom, right? It happens in the car after you drop your kids off or between meetings where there's just this tremendous grief that comes to the surface of what was lost. And sometimes it's really messy because it's not even what was lost. It was what I thought I had that
Hmm.
was never actually there, and that's the loss. So I would say your grief can happen in quiet when nobody ever knows, and that's okay. You don't owe anybody your grief. You also don't owe anyone an explanation of why you're questioning and why you're challenging. And as far as the curiosity piece, I think that a lot of there's a lot of fear around curiosity, because we've been taught that we can't trust ourselves. And so even curiosity around grief and just saying, my heart is broken. What is that about? I just came from a family gathering. Why am I so sad when I love these people so much, right? Missing out on, like, if you don't go to church anymore, missing out on a book club that used to, even if it's really toxic stuff, just sitting in the room with those folks, there's a lot of grief to not have those connections anymore. So I would say give yourself permission for curiosity to be really hard and really scary. Again, do it in private. Start with privacy. Start with a therapist, not a Christian counselor, not a pastor who offers advice and calls it counseling, but an actual therapist who's licensed. Vet them really, really well. And if you're really dealing with a lot of this coming out of a faith background, I would say get someone who is not at a faith-based organization. If you decide you're going to keep a lot of your beliefs, cool. But the last thing you need is a therapist who's bringing their own beliefs to the table and telling you what curiosity should look like, or how to solve your grief, or what's even worth grieving. Like, those are things that each of us should get to decide. But a lot of times we've not been taught that. We've been taught to, like, control. And it's really hard to control curiosity. Once you let curiosity out of the box, like, it doesn't go back into the box very easily. For people who are really having a hard time figuring out what curiosity is, one of my favorite activities to do with clients is to think about who you were before you started following all the rules. And sometimes it's really hard. I mean, sometimes people have to go back to, like, being 4 years old. Mm-hmm. What did you, as a 4-year-old, what did you as an innocent child find joy in? Bubbles, sidewalk chalk. Like, I've had people build sandcastles. Like, what was that brought you joy? Find those things and just let yourself do it, and just know that play and curiosity are part of the healing process. Even if the rest of the world would say, that's so childish, what they really mean is that's liberated. That's free. That's not full of shame. And that's how you work through grief. And that's how you get through these seasons of deep questioning that are just exhausting.
Well, I know the woods can be a lonely place, especially for people who feel separated from themselves and their neighbors and God. And it's really helpful to name some of these things and to begin that process of grief and curiosity. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts with us and the work that you've done to do this. You want to let everybody know where they can find you?
Yeah, so the easiest way to find me is my website, angelajharrington.com. You can also search for my most recent book, which is Embracing the Old Witch in the Woods, Liberating Feminine Wisdom from Christian Patriarchy. I'm on most of the socials, but my website has a contact form if you have questions for me. There's also dozens and dozens of blog posts on a lot of these things we've talked about that you, again, can scroll on your phone and nobody will know. And it just gets to be a place where you can start asking questions and learning without the pressure of having to explain it to anyone.
That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Thursday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.